In philosophical tradition, idealism is associated with German 18th and 19th century philosophy. I wonder if there's any causal influence there with the Indian idealism coming through the German philosophy.
Yeah, again, many PhDs have been written on this subject, and I think my own view would be that there wasn't a close textual influence. It wasn't that people like Hegel in Germany had read carefully all the Indian philosophers. They didn't really have the languages, and they didn't have access to the scripts as we now do, thanks to the internet and so on. So they didn't have the knowledge, but they got some big ideas, I think, from India. And Hegel's big idea can be centered on his definition of infinity. Classically, Christian philosophers in the West had said that God is infinite, and the infinite is completely opposed to the finite, and therefore God, the infinite, and the finite universe have nothing in common. They're completely different. The infinite excludes the finite by definition. What Hegel did was to say, no, actually infinite means nothing is outside it. If it's infinite, it excludes nothing. Therefore, by definition, but a different definition, everything must be part of the infinite. And that was the big move Hegel made to a monistic and spiritual view he called the ultimate reality, Geist, or absolute spirit. Now, this actually originated by thinking about what was meant by the notion of infinity, which was becoming a subject of inquiry in mathematics as well at that time. So that wasn't influenced by the Indian traditions, but Hegel had read the available texts, the Upanishads and so on, and he could see a sort of similarity. So there was a general influence, but it wasn't technically informed, and Hegel, I'm sorry to say, didn't think much of Indian religious thought.
But Schopenhauer was more explicitly indebted to Indian thought, I believe.
He certainly was. But again, he didn't really know the text in any detail. I mean, he knew what had been translated of the Upanishads. And of course, they are actually philosophical documents. I mean, if you read the Bible, it's not philosophical. You'd find it very difficult to find philosophical arguments. But in the Upanishads, you do find a concentration on the nature of the reality, the nature of the self, and the argument that the true self is identical with the supreme reality. So they are philosophical sorts of texts, and Schopenhauer was very influenced by that. And one reason it was used, of course, by Schopenhauer in particular, was because he didn't like the very anthropomorphic views of God with which he was familiar in German Lutheranism. He thought you've got to get away from that, thinking God is a person who arbitrarily sends people to hell or not. And so I think he found in the Indian traditions a very different approach, which is still a spiritual approach. I mean, Schopenhauer, although he was called the first great German atheist, wasn't really an atheist at all. He just didn't like God. He didn't like the word God, but he thought that the nature of reality was spiritual. He was an idealist, in other words. And I think, yes, he was very influenced by Indian modes of thought.
In Anglo-American philosophy, idealism flourished at the end of the 19th century. But now, most contemporary British and American philosophers look on that as a phase that we've moved beyond. Is that a fair assessment, would you say?
I think that's a fair assessment of the actual situation, but there are a few of us left. And I think we're a growing band. There'll be 4 by next year. Idealism is not fashionable. That's very true. One reason for that is the great success of science, which focuses on explaining human mental elements of consciousness in neurophysiological terms. That's had a great influence towards materialism. That's quite true. But I think most of the main arguments for idealism are still in place, and you find them mostly in some quantum physicists, people like Roger Penrose, who might say, well, maybe consciousness is fundamental to reality in some sense. And you get people saying they are Platonists. So there are a few. But the big question still remains, isn't it true that consciousness may have an ineliminable place in our ontology? You can't get rid of it. And then the question is, well, does it just emerge from matter? If it's different from matter, does it just emerge? Or maybe could matter be seen as something which only exists when consciousness exists? And that's a view I would hold myself. I obviously need a long time to convince anybody if I ever could. But idealism is still around in that form, that all the things we see and touch and feel are actually elements of consciousness.
And in your own philosophical development, have you felt that you've learnt from your studies of Indian philosophy things that you couldn't have learnt from the study of Western philosophy?
Well, I think the Indian philosophical traditions are very interesting. They begin from a different place than the Western tradition. When the Western tradition begins from thinking that a supreme consciousness would be a creator who is different from the creation and who creates it for some reason to get something done of some sort. Whereas the Indian traditions don't start there. They start from asking, what is the nature of this reality that we're in? And they say, in the Vedantic tradition, well, its nature is pure spirit. So you're not talking about another reality. You're talking about the true inner nature of this reality. Though there's no reason why Indian idealists shouldn't talk about God. They usually do say God is a sort of picture image of absolute consciousness. But you mustn't think of God as another person. That would be quite wrong. So I think it's a philosophically deep view. I mean, you're asking questions about the nature of consciousness. And is consciousness necessarily something that has to be embodied in a human brain and body? And my own view is the answer that is no, not necessarily. I don't think that I can see any necessity in that. And then if you explore the hypothesis, well, what if it wasn't? What if there were a consciousness which wasn't at all embodied and which could have something like thoughts, intelligence? Then would it be possible that this material universe was an expression of that? Perhaps I should say that in the Indian tradition there are two ways of taking this, which you might call a negative way and a positive way. The negative way is you say the whole of our empirical reality is an illusion. People use the word Maya. An illusion is something that is simply false. It's like a mirage in the desert. And you say, well, it's not there. And once you see through it, you see that the reality is just the one unified consciousness. That's the negative view. But there's a positive view, which is more associated with Ramanuja rather than Shankara. Ramanuja was 12th century, came after Shankara. And he held that it's not an illusion. The model that Ramanuja used was the world, the universe, is the body of the Lord. So the idea of the universe as God's body actually goes back to 12th century Indian philosophy. And saying that the world is the body of God has a positive impact, that maybe it's an expression of some of the potentialities within the divine consciousness which have to be expressed. And there you sound very much like Hegel, if you're getting into that the whole of history is the progressive self-revelation of the absolute. Where Hegel introduced something new was the idea of evolution or development, that the history is a progressive revelation of the absolute. And this passed back into more recent Indian thought, which is able to accept an evolutionary view in the sense of a progressive revelation, bit by bit, of what absolute reality is like.
Given the richness of the philosophical tradition in Indian thought that you've described, why do you think it's been so marginalised in Western philosophy departments?
Well, the language is difficult. I mean, you've got to have Sanskrit, really, and Sanskrit is a very difficult language to learn. And it's partly because the Indian traditions are classically, scripturally based on a very different scripture, the Upanishads, from anything in the West. Western philosophers have tended to say, this is not philosophy, this is just taking for revealed knowledge. But actually, it could be quite an interesting sort of philosophy, because you take your premises from somewhere and then you say, where do we go from there? And that's a very interesting thing to do. But that's why it's been neglected. And so it's a pity, but it's a rather neglected field in Britain. But maybe it'll all change.
Keith Ward, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And you can hear more Philosophy Bites at www.philosophybites.com.